A warm welcome to your Sunday morning. Probably. It's Sunday, isn't it?
Yes, it's Sunday.
Thank you, Dave. There's my voice in my head. That's Dave. I'm sure you can hear that too because we have extrasensory perception. The voices I hear in my head, you can hear in your head now as well. We're here at 0344 499 1000. Wasn't that a wonderful discussion on health with Monica? She can't stay, obviously. We've got to move the show on, but Monica Price 5 on Twitter. If you have an issue, she'll be there to answer your questions right now. And, of course, she comes in regularly on other shows as well, so she'll be back. So keep tuned to TalkTV. And now we're going to talk about foreign affairs in some detail with someone who is an expert who's extremely well placed when it comes to the US. Martha Miller is our guest, a foreign policy consultant and analyst at the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School, a Washington-based special assistant, a consultant and analyst. She served George W. Bush, advising him on appointments to prominent national security and diplomatic positions, presidential delegations, international assemblies, and government advisory board appointments. And Martha also served 5 years on Capitol Hill on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as a legislative assistant to Senator Gordon Smith. She is, of course, a Republican. Welcome along to the show, Martha Miller.
Hi, Johnny. Thank you for having me.
Martha, it's nice to have you on. So George W. Bush was your president. Is Donald Trump your president? Is that a different kind of Republican stripe to the one that you're used to?
Well, they're quite different.
I thought I'd start you with an easy question.
They're pretty different in style.
They are. They are.
So I'm probably more of a Bush Republican.
Yeah.
Although certainly there were policies that all Republicans could support.
Yeah.
Arguably, if you could separate some personality preferences to see through to the policies that took place. So
sure.
Anyway.
You can coalesce around certain things. But, you know, let me ask you this. I mean, he did amazing things. His administration broke the impasse in the Middle East. 4 countries today have signed peace deals with Israel, including the most unlikely of them being Sudan. Sudan, a hotbed of virulent anti-Zionism as late as the 60s, as late as the 80s, where Ethiopian Jews were rescued from inside Sudan, 700 miles inside enemy lines. I mean, Sudan is a difficult country with a difficult history and yet is a peace partner with Israel only in the Donald Trump administration. And, you know, people might not like the way Donald Trump holds his knife and fork. You know, his news conferences are a bit, hey, you're so rude and I'm top of the ratings and you're not, and all this kind of crazy stuff. And he's got a funny haircut and, you know, all that kind of stuff, and you don't believe him, and drink bleach or whatever. But even so, he hired some great people who were part of his administration, who dealt in facts on the ground and broke through. And I've come to know a few of these people. I'm talking about the great Len Chodorkovsky, who was in the State Department in marketing affairs with relation to Iran and the Abraham Accords, and Jason Greenblatt, who authored Peace to Prosperity alongside Jared Kushner and Ambassador David Friedman. So, you know, it does take a commander-in-chief of whatever stripe to sometimes strike the right chord and hire the right people, Martha.
No, certainly the Abraham Accords were groundbreaking.
Yeah.
And that was actually a very remarkable achievement that I think potentially couldn't have happened with, I would say, a traditional politician potentially, but
interesting.
And maybe it could have, but it did take someone who was probably willing to, I guess, what's the best way to put it?
Look at a different way of dealing with the problems, not repeating the same diplomatic routes like John Kerry, who made a huge faux pas. I can't believe he's still working, actually. I know he's on climate now, but, I mean, he said very famously, read my lips, you know, there'll be no peace in the Middle East before, you know, I've spoken to people, and he said something like, there'll be no peace before Israel and Palestinian Authority get together and make peace. And, I mean, he went, no, 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 and no. And yes, 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 and yes. 4 times, 4 countries.
Right.
I mean, he's made to look a bit silly, isn't he?
Well, you know,
You probably
President
know
Bush, I don't know him personally. I did encounter him a few times at the Foreign Relations Committee back in the day. But you know, I think again, you know, the Abraham Accords, I'm actually a big fan of,
Yeah.
and I'm thankful that transpired, and I think we're all in a better place today, thanks to the Abraham Accords, for sure.
Yeah. Now, obviously, you are a proud American, someone who's proud of their service. I am very concerned about the United States diplomatic position when it comes to the United Nations. I had a recent conversation with the UN Watch executive director, the chief, Hillel Neuer, who says in his near couple of decades at the UN in Geneva, he has watched America kind of retreat from some of the key influences that it had, as China has gone from being a diplomatic backwater to being very aggressive, joining different instruments of power at the UN in human rights and various other, you know, women's bodies and stuff. And so therefore they can wash away all the kind of human rights abuses that they have in their country because they appear to have the UN rubber stamp of legitimacy. What's America going to do? We need America to be strong at the UN. Otherwise, the UN is absolutely a chocolate teapot. It is useless without America standing up to China.
Well, I think Americans are more and more comfortable with standing up to China. I think the United Nations, the format itself, has been undermined by having members of the Human Rights Committee, you know, to include human rights abusers. That's been a problem for years. It's something that I know has been pointed out by numerous administrations. I think even quite a few Democrats have spoken out on that as well. So that's something that concerns a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, I would say. You know, what to do in terms of the United Nations, you know, I don't think you're going to see the United States ever walk out in terms of membership. But you know, it is pretty interesting as we think about Ukraine and what has happened this year. The fact that Russia sits on the Security Council certainly doesn't help the UN's credibility, given what Russia has clearly done this year alone.
Which brings us on to a major part of our discussion this morning, Martha. One of the many reasons that we've invited you on. Russia is a nuclear country. And again, even though this is a conventional war and it's taken the West by surprise, and it seems to turn back the clock 100 years to the sort of terrible wars that we fought in the 20th century, one of the reticences behind the Western nations putting boots on the ground is that an escalation could precipitate a nuclear war in a way that the First World War and indeed the end of the Second World War saw it in Japan, but is stopping the world from engaging with Russia in a way that perhaps it might have done 80 years ago. What's to stop Russia from using either a chemical or nuclear weapon of some kind because they're on the verge of maybe losing this war to Ukraine?
The thing is, Putin knows that if Russia does such a thing, the U.S. would be compelled to respond.
Mm.
I think even the Biden administration, which has not been as forward-leaning as other U.S. administrations, I think even the Biden administration knows this. The Pentagon certainly comes up with options. I'm sure they have, they have options for everything, for every contingency. That's what the Pentagon is good at. Aside from just responding to things. So bottom line is it would have to be met with consequential response. That's what President Biden said in his remarks with 60 Minutes in his interview. So, and I think that's right. We cannot abide chemical and nuclear weapons being used, and there has to be a strong response.
Yes. Even to the rhetoric. And in Piers Morgan's first show on TalkTV, when he made his debut, when we launched our television channel, which is what this is now, Piers Morgan's first interview, Uncensored, was with President Donald Trump. And President Trump said in the interview, I'd stop Putin from using the N-word, the nuclear word. Stop using it, because he was using it at the beginning of the war. And that's right, isn't it, Martha? You have to say, because actually it is part of an abuse of the United Nations Charter, isn't it? When you start threatening the use of the word, the N-word, the nuclear word, you are breaking a convention, and we haven't seen that under the Biden administration, have we?
Well, I mean, I think certainly Russia has thwarted all conventions through their actions. They rolled into the neighboring country saying that it should belong to them. They have committed atrocities. They have tortured civilians, including children and women. This has been
terrible,
pretty unparalleled and pretty unfathomable for the 21st century. So the term "never again," sadly, it keeps being repeated in different ways. So, I think the only thing that they understand is strength. And the United States, the UK, actually, Liz Truss is actually, as Minister of Defense, was actually quite good, I thought, in the very early days, especially when people were still assessing the situation. And in many ways, interestingly, I thought the UK was more forward-leaning than the United States in terms of supporting Ukraine in a very vocal way. And putting weapons behind her words. So in any case, I'm digressing a bit, but I was happy to see Liz Truss as the new prime minister.
Yeah.
I think that's actually from an American perspective, that's reassuring, particularly when it comes to Ukraine.
You're not digressing from one of my questions, Martha, which was one I had prepared, which is, with Truss in power replacing Johnson. Johnson was a student of history, like few other British prime ministers. In a sense, this was him imbibing his inner Churchill. He understood the threat from Russia in the Ukraine, notwithstanding Hitler's invasion of Sudetenland and Poland. It looked rather similar, and he understood exactly what needed to be done. And Liz Truss, as you say, as Secretary of State for Defense, also backed up those words. Now we have an unexpected, unscheduled meeting between the Prime Minister and the President this weekend because of the sad departure of our Queen. Apparently it's going to be only a gentle, cordial introduction before a more fulsome meeting next week. Do you think Liz Truss will continue the good work of Boris Johnson? Do you think she'll be even more emboldened to help, or will it be a continuation of what Johnson did with Zelensky?
I mean, based on what I've seen of her actions as defense minister, I think she'll continue to be a strong friend to Ukraine. And I think she has a strong backbone, if you will, when it comes to standing up for what's right. And also, but she also has an interesting, delicate kind of diplomatic way of conveying strength. And that actually goes over well, I think, with counterparts in Europe. That's my read, at least, from following things so far with Ukraine in particular. But I actually think, when she meets with President Biden, she should, remind him, that we have to help Ukraine achieve victory. We can't settle for a negotiated peace. Victory is really the only solution.
Because, of course, a negotiated peace would enable Russia to at least have advanced their political influence over Ukraine. And that just can't happen. We can't allow that. We have seen what happened in Kosovo in their settlement with Serbia, where some of the Serbian parliament has a guarantee of 12.5% of Serbian delegates in their parliament, in a country where there aren't 12.5% of the population as ethnic Serbs. So we can't have that sort of bullying of a bigger country invading a smaller country, cynically doing that so that they can end the war quickly and negotiate some kind of permanent influence over the country which will imprison them, which we just can't have that. Can I ask you, with your foreign policy expertise in hand, what do you think Russia will do after this startling success of Russia? I'm not talking about a military response. I'm talking about perhaps what might happen to Russia in the world. This is bad news for Putin. And I suppose China as well will look at Russia with a little bit less respect than they had.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, a couple of things. I think China is watching this closely, and I think that's even more so why we need to have a victory. Ukraine needs a victory. NATO needs to have Ukraine have a victory.
Yeah.
Because China's looking at this. I'm sure they're a little irritated with Russia, because it probably would have been better for China if Russia had not gone in this year, but perhaps waited, and then they probably would have had a two-pronged, attack on Taiwan and Russia on Ukraine. Is I think what I think would be what she would have wanted potentially. So I think the best way to deter China and anyone else who wants to disrupt normal life in the West is to demonstrate that we will not put up with this.
Martha Miller is foreign policy consultant and analyst at the National Security Institute at the George Mason University Antonin Scalia Law School, a former advisor to President George W. Bush. It's fantastic to have her with us in the TalkTV show of overnights here, and we'll talk more to Martha in just a moment. And later on, just after the news at 4, we'll go through the Sunday papers, and early breakfast with Christo follows me. Then weekend breakfast with Dr. David Bull. Richard Tice is in the chair at 10. Trisha's along at 1 o'clock. Kevin's along at 4 o'clock. Mark Saggers with the Sunday Night Club. What a great show. I've loved hosting that show when I stood in for Mark a couple of weeks ago. And then The Unexplained with Howard Hughes. That's Howard actually explaining the unexplained. It's not Howard being a presenter and that's unexplained. Should point that out. Howard's explaining the unexplained. And I hope that explains that. Right, Martha Miller after this short break. Stay tuned, Talk TV.
I'm Ian Collins, and you're watching TalkTV, the home of straight talking. What makes me angry? People who own reptiles make me angry. Why would you own a snake when you live on the 14th floor of a flat in Maidstone? I mean, that's just ridiculous. On a more serious level, what makes me angry? The middle-class intelligentsia, the kind of Guardianista characters that purport to walk in the shoes of ordinary people that actually haven't got a clue what it's really like.
She was our greatest export, our greatest leader, the greatest of Britons. Queen Elizabeth was a unique person. She was a wonderful human being. She was somebody that this country will miss enormously. Thank you, Mum, for everything you did for us. You were a unique and extraordinarily special human being, and we will deeply miss you.
I'm Julia Hartley-Brewer, and this is TalkTV. I think my most memorable and proudest moment in journalism over all these years is actually being on air during the lockdowns, even when I had COVID myself. Over the last 2 years, getting people to tell their stories, not just about people who lost loved ones to COVID, but people who lost their fundamental freedoms, their children's schooling, their mental health, their physical health, their businesses, and giving people the chance to tell their stories about how it affected them.
Join me, Ian Collins, every day on TalkTV.
There is nothing we hate more than hypocrisy.
Discussing the big issues.
Why was it so hard to establish the deputy leader was at a meeting with her colleagues?
The callers.
Alan in Grimsby, Tracy in Burton-on-Trent. Dave, thank you very much.
Picking apart the big stuff.
This simply does not wash. Look who's back under the spotlight.
You are welcome to join us, and we're dipping into foreign affairs. We're talking about the war in Ukraine involving Russia. We're talking about how China views Russia now. We're talking about the retreat of America at the UN, and of course we're talking about how Liz Truss will differ from Boris Johnson over Zelensky in Ukraine. And our guest, Martha Miller, seems to think, and hopefully so, that there'll be a straight line between where Liz Truss and Boris Johnson are on the Ukraine, and that we will be certain allies to the Ukraine in much the same way as we were with Boris. Welcome back to the show, Martha.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for having me.
well, it's a pleasure to have you. And prior to your government service, you worked in the Bundestag in Berlin, America House in Heidelberg, and the U.S. Embassy office in Berlin. And already we are seeing in public buildings in Germany, they're turning off the heat, they're turning off the lights, because Germany relies far too much on energy from Russia, and Russia's playing at them as a diplomatic weapon against the war in Ukraine. How much of a miscalculation has Germany's reliance on Russia been, and why didn't anyone press the panic button all those years ago?
So, you know, this is something that has befuddled people in Washington and elsewhere for a number of years now. You know, it started with Nord Stream 1, and, you know, that was under Gerhard Schröder, who was a member of the Social Democratic Party, and who was Gerhard Schröder is now, of course, has been for some time, essentially a Russian agent, or, you know, technically a lobbyist. And, you know, there are, you know, so Nord Stream 1 was bad enough. And the United States did warn the Germans that this was a bad idea at the time. They proceeded anyway. Then Nord Stream 2 went forward under Angela Merkel, who's a member of the Christian Democratic Union. And that actually got started, if I'm remembering this correctly, after Russia invaded Crimea. So, you know, and President Biden at the time was vice president, and he spoke out against Nord Stream 2. The Obama administration tried to get the Germans to stop it or to not go forward. President Bush spoke out against Nord Stream 1. So this has been a bipartisan concern from the United States. I don't know the extent to which the UK weighed in, but I can't imagine that was something that any of your prime ministers were excited about. But, I think other NATO allies have expressed concerns over the years as well. And Germany kept saying, oh no, this is just a business deal. There's no political pieces to this. We've never had trouble receiving gas from Russia. They've never stopped it. They've never used it as a weapon, as a political weapon. Although they did actually stop, I think there was a brief break in service actually in the GDR days.
Right.
So it's they're kind of not remembering all the pieces of their history, but
yes.
The problem is there's actually kind of a long-standing. What's the best way to say it? There's just been, the German society. I think they're conflicted to some extent. Just the history between Germany and Russia, it goes all the way back to Catherine the Great, who was German, but then became the Russian Tsarina. Anyway, today what we have is a problem on the German left in particular, especially the SPD. Some pieces of the German center-right, some politicians there, but then also especially the far right and the far left as well. But the biggest problem is the SPD because that is the chancellor's party. And there's a Russophilia, they call them Russlandversteher. So it's kind of Russian sympathizers.
Wow, that's the hard left who are in power.
So the hard left, I mean, you could say, I guess it depends on your perspective. What is the hard left?
I think anyone who supports Russia in the West is sort of, if you like, in this country, it might be translated as people who would support Jeremy Corbyn and others.
Right.
Presumably.
Right. Well, and actually there is a connection between that political party and Die Linke in Germany. Die Linke is actually the successor party to the ruling party of the GDR. And it's a successor party. It's a legal successor to the GDR. They're called the Die Linke. They actually did lose a number of seats in the Bundestag this go round, but nonetheless, they hold power at the state level in several of the Eastern German states, and actually in Bremen as well, I believe. So it's not just Eastern Germany.
It sounds like Germany has a real democratic problem here, because there seems to be the similar kind of schisms that we're experiencing in other countries, and it's a bit more visible and more reported in France when you think about Le Pen versus Macron, which was a very clear choice. We had that period where, as I've just mentioned his name, Corbyn was, if you like, accidental Labour leader when Ed Miliband decided to let all and sundry into the Labour Party for £3, and they all voted for Jeremy Corbyn to be their leader, this obscure backbencher who then took Labour into uncharted territory, and they ended up being censured by the Equality and Human Rights Commission for anti-Semitism, which is a pretty disgraceful blot on their copybook, because the only other party that did experience that punishment were the British National Party, which are essentially the National Front and a far-right party. And it seems to me that German politics, the extremes in German politics seem to have returned after about 75 years.
Well, I mean, I think the far right is the Alternative for Germany party. The far left, Die Linke, they both are have strongholds in what is the former East Germany. I think, a lot explains that if you look to the history of how things unfolded with reunification and how they privatized, and there was just a lot of people who felt disaffected, who lost their sense of purpose. They lost a sense of, how do you even have your footing, regaining their footing in a new landscape, new economic and political and social landscape. And I think that's still difficult even today.
It's very good to tap your knowledge of Germany because of your experience in that country. What about Germany's position in the European Union? And obviously, since Britain left the European Union, Germany has become, if you like, on its own, the most powerful country alongside France, and Germany is out ahead. I was talking to a Greek citizen, and they wanted Britain in the European Union because they were worried that Germany would not be counterbalanced by another major European power. And yet we have seen, since Russia invaded Ukraine, that Germany's power has been rather compromised, hasn't it? It's not the great almighty power in Europe as it was. Has the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia diminished Germany within the European Union slightly, or is that a bit of an exaggeration?
I think it's been diminished in the sense that it has brought into question what they stand for, in the sense that, and I'm thinking primarily about, there's been an awakening and a bit of an awakening, and I think some camaraderie that has formed between the Central and Eastern European countries that naturally feared Russian power and were skeptical kind of always. So them plus the Baltics, and then the Nordic countries. There's a reason Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO this year.
Yeah, of course.
The Nordics, I think this is an interesting, in my opinion, what is transpiring is a bit of a coalescing of concerns over how to proceed and how Germany has proceeded, and how France, how they've dealt with Russia this year, having the multiple phone calls from Macron and Schultz to Putin without consulting other European countries. I think that made folks nervous in these smaller countries who always did have concerns about Russia. I think Germans didn't have the same concerns. They didn't have this sense of like a visceral fear,
right? Because
they felt somewhat protected by their size, and I think in the prior kind of historical relationship with Russia, and I think the French as well to some degree, felt protected and comfortable with having a kind of strange but workable relationship as they saw it.
Perhaps a touch of complacency has been part of the European political scene. Martha Miller, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you tonight. Thank you very much for joining us. Martha Miller, foreign policy consultant and expert all the way from Capitol Hill in Washington. What a brilliant hour that's been. It started with Monica Price and it has finished with Martha Miller. You're welcome to stay tuned. We got early breakfast with Christo at 5 o'clock, but before that, we're going to review the papers after a short break for the news and various other topics with Sophia Wensler. I'm Johnny Gould. This is Talk TV. It's overnight, and you're welcome to stick with us.